Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Whitehall, to the Whitehall Lecture Series. My name is John Blades. I am the director of the Flagler Museum, and it's my privilege to welcome you all here on behalf of the trustees and the staff of the museum. I want to take just a minute to thank Related for being the sponsor of this lecture series. They do some great work in West Palm Beach, and we're happy to have them as sponsors. I also want to take a minute to thank the staff who work very hard behind the scenes to make this all look easy. Please take a moment to make sure your cell phones are off. Please don't take that for granted. Just take a second to make sure they're off. And if you happen to have entered the room with one of those audio tour wands, please hold that up so we can collect that. There's an internal alarm in those wands that can be set off by the AV system here. The Whitehall Lecture Series is streamed live, so if for any reason you can't join us live here in the Grand Ballroom, you can join us from anywhere in the world via the internet at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon for the lectures. And we archive the lectures as well so that you can see them again later, or if you're not able to join us live, you can see them at a later date. You just go to the programs page, lecture series page, and click on the button that says see the lecture. This year's lecture series is titled Unlikely Titans of Industry and Commerce, From Modest Beginnings to Phenomenal Success. And here with us today for our fourth lecture in the series which is on James Cash Penney. We didn't put the full name up there, but I love that name. We should have. James Cash Penney. What a great name for a retailer, right? Is David Kruger, who wrote the book on James Cash Penney, J.C. Penney, the Man, the Store, and American Agriculture. And Mr. Kruger's the agriculture and business librarian at the University of Wyoming, so he's come from the frigid north to join us here in Palm Beach. And that library has, what did you tell me, 5 or 6 million?
2 million print volumes and about 3.6.
So about a little 5.5 million things to keep track of. Amazing. And you had a career with the Army, and he had a career as a retailer, so I think we've got the right person to talk about James Cash Penney. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Kruger to the Whitehall Lecture Series. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this lecture. It's truly an honor for me to be here in such a spectacular place as Whitehall. And I think we'll, without further ado, as John mentioned, I've come all the way from Wyoming, and my home is about 2,000 miles from Palm Beach, and more than that, 1.5 miles above Palm Beach. Laramie is about 7,300 feet above sea level. So the high today in Laramie, I checked, was about 40 degrees, and that's a warm February. So in addition to the opportunity to be here with all of you, it's a pleasant reprieve from a frigid Wyoming winter. But as some of you know, the subject of my talk also got his start in Wyoming, opening his first store in the tiny town of Kemmer. And if you ever go to that place, it's spelled Kemmerer, but the locals will tell you we only stutter when we write it. So when you say it, you say just Kemmer. That's what they told me when I was talking there. But 122 years later, that store is still in operation, and these humble beginnings in Wyoming did not stop James Cash Penney from quickly making his mark on the rest of the country, transcending that first store to more than 1,700 J.C. Penney stores across the United States. And at one point, more than 60 of those locations were right here in Florida, as you can see, with Penney's abbreviated name certainly a part of anyone who spent their formative years in this country, from back-to-school shopping during childhood to buying fashions and home goods in adulthood. The leitmotif of this year's Whitehall Lectures involves unlikely titans of industry and commerce, and includes not only J.C. Penney, but Henry Ford, George Westinghouse, Thomas Edison, and fellow retail icons John Wanamaker and F.W. Woolworth. Mr. Penney was a rather modest man throughout his 95-year life, and would likely be quite flattered, if not uncomfortable, to be considered a titan 53 years after his death, especially in the company of these 5 titans, regardless of how unlikely their successes might have been. Their lives, like Penney's, may have occurred during the Gilded Age, but their successes and fame had come long before Penney's did, and he was well aware of and very much in awe of who they were. Each of them were also considerably older than Penney, with all but Henry Ford old enough to be Penney's father. Ironically, Penney's closest contemporaries, at least in age, were historical figures with completely different ideas about capitalism and religion. Vladimir Lenin was a mere 5 years older than J.C. Penney, while Joseph Stalin was born just 3 years later, all three men born within an 8-year time period. By dint of a later birth and a nearly 100-year lifespan, James Cash Penney was perhaps the only Titan who lived through the Gilded Age, as well as the arrivals of the Cold War, air conditioning, Elvis Presley, the Beatles both arriving for the Ed Sullivan Show and the breakup on the roof, and color televisions bearing his name, which he liked to use for watching his favorite artist, Lawrence Welk. By his 90th birthday, he had gotten to know Presidents Hoover, Roosevelt, and Truman, and was very good friends with Eisenhower, who pleasantly expressed disbelief that Penney was as old as he was. Even his son-in-law, a doctor at Johns Hopkins, gave Penney a personal examination and commented to his wife, who was J.C. Penney's daughter, Mary Frances, that the calf muscles in her father's legs astonishingly resembled those not of an elderly man, but a powerful younger athlete. Nevertheless, the younger James Cash Penney had very little time to meet his heroes, assuming they even had the time or the desire to meet with him. From 1902 to 1917, he had thrown himself into building what would become America's first nationwide department store chain. By the time Penney relocated himself and his firm from Wyoming to New York City, 12 years after opening his first store, he was literally working himself to death until ordered by a doctor to change his workaholic lifestyle before he ended up, in Penney's words, under sod. Westinghouse was already gone by then, and within 5 years, Woolworth and Wanamaker would soon follow. Consequently, there is no historical evidence that Penney ever got to meet Westinghouse, Wanamaker, or Woolworth over the course of their enterprising lives. He did, however, get to meet both Thomas Edison and Henry Ford 4 years before their respective deaths. Edison had accepted Penney's 1927 invitation to visit his Penney Farms agricultural colony just south of Jacksonville. The two Titans also shared a mutual friend in Harvey Firestone, with Firestone and Edison, of course, being close friends with fellow Titan Henry Ford. Penney had been wanting to meet Ford for decades, yet even at 67, he had never gotten the opportunity or the requisite invitation from Ford himself. In a sense, we started out in rather the same way, Penney explained. He too was a farmer's son. He left the farm to be an apprentice in a machine shop. I left it to sell dry goods. He borrowed $10,000 to get started. I borrowed $1,500 for the same purpose. The two men would finally get together in 1943 when Penney was visiting the J.C. Penney store in downtown Savannah, Georgia, and Ford, who was clandestinely operating out of an office building he owned down the street, summoned his assistant to summon Penney for an evening meal. Even at 68, Penney was starstruck by the invitation. We conversed about many subjects, said Penney. Naturally, his philosophies on production and distribution methods were of great interest to me. We were in accord that serving the public well is of first importance, a determining factor in success. For this and allied reasons, I don't put any great stock in the mounting refrain that the little fellow no longer has a chance and can't meet the competition. There couldn't have been a little fellower than I when I started out with my first store. John Wanamaker, while strikingly similar to Penney in golden rule philosophies and Christian business principles, was actually on his third retail location, the Grand Depot in Philadelphia, at the time of Penney's 1875 birth. While both men would bear great similarities as Christian merchants, Penney's early stores were never intended in form or function to be palaces of consumption. In contrast to Wanamaker's massive stores in Philadelphia and New York City, Penney operated his tiny cash and carry outlets in more than 1,000 rural communities across the United States, many with fewer than 1,000 residents. Furthermore, it is unlikely that Wanamaker directly influenced Penney during his formative years as a young merchant. When it came to the Golden Rule, Penney's greatest personal mentor was his father, James Cash Penney Sr., a preacher/farmer who ingrained deep Christian values in his son, and Thomas Callahan and Guy Johnson, the retail mentors who would truly give Penney his start in their stores, literally called the Golden Rule. While Wanamaker operated gigantic department stores in Philadelphia and New York, the smaller emporiums of F.W. Woolworth and J.C. Penney would dot main streets across the United States, sharing walls and in some cases even rooftops. Nevertheless, despite their ubiquitous presence throughout the 20th century, Woolworth had opened his first 5 and 10 when Penney was 4 years old. By the time Penney opened his first Golden Rule store in 1902, at the age of 26, a 50-year-old Woolworth was already overseeing 100 locations across the United States, and by 1912, more than 600. I'm going to take a quick swig of water, if you guys don't mind. Hydrate or die, as one of my colleagues said. Regardless of any external praise we might heap upon James Cash Penney today, he would modestly rebut that of these 5 titans, he was the least likely to attain even modest success, much less the wealth and power that came from creating America's first transcontinental department store chain. Nevertheless, even as a senior citizen in the 1950s, Fortune magazine still proclaimed Penney king of the soft goods. Others lauded him as Main Street merchant or merchant prince based on popular biographies about his life and retail empire. In 1963, when an 88-year-old Penney showed up for an interview with a major American newspaper, dressed in a dapper 3-piece suit, bow tie, and hat, the awaiting journalist remarked that he always looked like a man who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. "It was more likely a tin fork," Penney casually replied as he pulled up a chair, "for I grew up on a farm in Missouri and my parents were very poor." That farm in question was also where James Cash Penney came into this world on September 16, 1875. Penney's ancestors were among the earliest of American immigrants, believed to have come from England, specifically the Isle of Wight, to the colony of Virginia in 1621. Penney's great-grandfather, John Penney, was likewise born in Virginia, but had made his way to Kentucky by the 1700s. Before Penney's grandfather, Eli, who was born in Kentucky, would migrate again in 1840 to the then frontier of northwest Missouri. Penney's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all made their living from farming, though their true calling was preaching in rural Christian ministries. "My father was in reality a Baptist clergyman," Penney remarked in 1926, "but was compelled to find a means of livelihood aside from the ministry because the congregations which he served did not, at that time, believe in paying their ministers." Penney's parents may have been short on money, but they were anything but unrefined hillbillies. Both of them believed greatly in education, reflected Penney. "As the son of an old-school Baptist preacher who preached the greater part of his life without pay, I was brought up to work hard, to be thrifty, to honor and obey, love and respect my parents, and to believe in a personal God. That early religious training at the hands of my old-school Baptist father and my sainted mother has been a bulwark to me for lo these many years. All that I am or that I may become has its roots in that early training." Nevertheless, life on the Penney farm was always frugal and at times difficult. Of the 12 children born to Penney's parents, only 6 of them, 3 boys and 3 girls, would survive to adulthood. Penney felt a deep bond for both of his parents, and particularly his father, accompanying him around the family farm throughout his formative years, where he would listen to ongoing lessons not only about agriculture, but Christian faith and morality. In many ways, J.C. Penney Sr. was as much a mentor to J.C. Penney Jr. as he was a father. He introduced the younger Penney to the concept of the Golden Rule, not only in words, but deeds. Sometimes the father's lessons could be less than pleasant for the son. On Penney's 8th birthday, his father informed him he would have to start earning his own money to buy his own clothing. After building up a childhood hog operation to do just that, Penney's father forced him to liquidate it on account that the smell was becoming a nuisance to the neighbors down the road. When Penney later set up a highly successful watermelon stand as a teenager, his father publicly shut that down as well on account that the son had wrongfully set it up outside the county fairgrounds siphoning business away from county fair vendors who had rightfully paid their concession fees to operate inside the same venue. For a long time, I thought he'd been too hard on me, recalled Penney. I meant no wrong. Even though he said that wasn't any excuse, I thought it should be. But what he said, what had happened, soaked in. Without my realizing the full extent for a long time, it soaked in so deep that it became ingrained in my way of doing things. Once again, in his direct, unadorned way, my father had instilled in me a point of honor which, as time went on, revealed itself to me in the form of a foundation stone of human dealing in the business world. Money is important, but the practice of the golden rule in making money, as in every other aspect of human relations, is the most substantial asset of civilized man. Penney's father recognized his son's gift as a merchant, and rather than encourage him to become a father, steered him toward a career in retail. The father went so far as to contact J.M. Hale, the owner of a large department store in nearby Hamilton, and request a working apprenticeship be set up to help his son learn the retail trade. Penney's work at J.M. Hale would quickly become a full-time job and quite possibly his employer for life. Unfortunately, just after Penney turned 19, tuberculosis would claim the life of his father. Within 2 years, Penney began to develop similar symptoms. His mother had already buried a husband and 6 children. Fearing tuberculosis was going to claim the life of another child, a fear that was validated by the local doctor in the hometown, she urged Penney to leave the familiarity of Missouri for the drier climates and unknown culture of the American West. In the aftermath of his father's death, Penney's forced departure from Missouri marked a very sad time in his life. Although he had amassed a little bit of a fortune in savings, about $300 to be precise, he was ultimately dejected about where his life appeared to be headed. And as you can see, he said, "I doubt very much if any boy anywhere ever left his hometown with any less prospects than did I." Nevertheless, Penney boarded a train bound to Denver, Colorado. He had no friends or family in the mile-high city, but as the largest metropolitan area in the region, Denver was the most likely destination for a full-time position. Penney unhappily found employment first at Joslin's, a flagship department store where fellow clerks would connive to steal his sales commissions, before moving to a fly-by-night dry goods outlet with questionable business practices. In the late 19th century, working in retail was generally a dead-end career unless you were a member of the owner's family. Opportunities out of lower-level positions like sales clerks were generally quite limited, and profit-sharing opportunities of any kind simply did not exist for mainline employees. Penney hated living in a big city like Denver, much less working in its urban retail environments. Furthermore, as a teetotaler, he had virtually no social life outside of the retail workplace. After 1 year of misery, though, he spotted a newspaper listing for a butcher shop in nearby Longmont, Colorado, then a farm town north of Denver with around 2,000 residents. Penney took everything he had saved to Longmont and acquired the business for himself, with the front window soon proclaiming his role as its sole proprietor. Just 23 at the time, he later admitted he may have been in over his head. Furthermore, he was quite naive about how business relations worked with the meat shop's biggest customer, the head chef at a local hotel. The chef, who placed large orders of meat every week, expected a complimentary bottle of whiskey with every order. Although Penney was a fervent teetotaler, he reluctantly provided the alcoholic gift with the customer's first delivery. However, the guilt from having done so led Penney to refrain from ever doing it again, and the chef, of course, responded by refusing to do business with Penney ever again, and the loss of the meat shop's biggest customer inevitably forced James Cash Penney out of business. However, just across the street from that meat shop was a small but impressive department store, literally called the Golden Rule. Penney had always been impressed by the store, and particularly its ambitious proprietor, an elder fellow Missouri transplant named Thomas Callahan. Essentially broke and desperate for income, Penney approached Callahan for a job, and Callahan agreed to take him on as a temporary sales clerk, but only for the holidays, cautioning Penney that he would likely have to let him go after Christmas. Penney not only enjoyed working for Thomas Callahan, but was deeply intrigued by Callahan's business model. The store bought and sold its merchandise on a cash-only basis, with a moral conviction that selling on credit encouraged people to live beyond their means. Callahan's store wasn't simply called the Golden Rule. As a matter of Christian business principles, the store also practiced what it preached, selling only quality merchandise at the lowest possible cash price, while treating customers as well as employees the way they would want to be treated. Even competitors were treated with the same consideration and respect. Callahan's Golden Rule method was unconventional, yet it was also proving to be quite lucrative, and not just in Longmont, Colorado. He informed Penney that the Longmont store was one of merely 6 in a chain of Golden Rule stores he had started, and the 5 new locations, all of them in small rural towns, were opened and operated by sales clerks Callahan had mentored in Longmont. Particularly appealing to Penney was his plan for employee advancement and profit-sharing partnerships. Callahan respectfully called his employees associates, and if a Golden Rule associate was ready to manage a new store and could come up with the 1/3 investment needed to open it, Callahan would provide the remaining balance, and as partners, they would share store profits accordingly. Beyond those incentives, Callahan's store also provided Penney with romance. A female store clerk, Berta Hess, had captivated Penney's heart and soul, and Penney knew she was the woman that he wanted to marry. In 1899, however, Callahan broke the bad news to Penney that he could no longer keep him employed in Longmont. However, Callahan offered Penney a full-time clerk position at another Golden Rule store 400 miles to the west, this one in the town of Evanston, Wyoming. Its manager, Guy Johnson, had previously been a sales clerk in Longmont before becoming a partner in Callahan's retail chain, and Callahan felt that Guy Johnson could mentor Penney as a future store manager and potential partner as well. Penney, of course, accepted the offer, moved to Evanston, and threw himself into learning everything he could about retail from Guy Johnson, who became as influential a mentor as Thomas Callahan had previously been. Even his new wife, Berta, whom he married immediately afterward, played a role in his rapid professional development. "From the moment I married," said Penney, "I had a real helpmate. Many a night when she sensed that I wanted to keep working at the store, she packed my supper in a tin pail and brought it to me. Very often she supplied me with hints about how to add service and value from a woman's point of view, and I felt that whatever position of independence I might grow to in the future, in my wife I had my first and most invaluable partner." Penney quickly earned a reputation of being one of the top clerks in Johnson and Callahan's chain, and by 1901, both men believed that Penney, at just 25 years old, was more than ready to manage his own store. And if he came up with his share for opening it, becoming a profit-sharing partner with Johnson and Callahan, the only question was where this store would be. Eventually, the partners settled on Penney's own suggestion of the Wyoming town of Kemmer, then a mining and sheep ranching community of just 700 residents. Penney selected the location himself. The tiny building was not much more than the sheds that are for sale in a Home Depot parking lot. Furthermore, it was located outside of the coveted Kemmer Triangle, but provided cheap rent and very low overhead since it had no running water or electricity. The night before the grand opening, Penney distributed handbills throughout the downtown area. On the grand opening day, the following morning, he introduced himself personally to every customer, offering a tour of the store while demonstrating the quality of his merchandise and the value inherent in his lower cash prices. Customer service was of utmost importance, and Penney committed to memory not only the names and faces of these new customers, but in many cases the sizes of hats, shirts, and shoes they wore. The grand opening of Penney's first store was obviously a family affair, with wife Berta serving as his head clerk and their infant son Roswell sleeping underneath the sales counter. All 3 of them lived inside the store in what was little more than an attic above the sales floor, with only a wood stove for heat and kerosene lamps for evening illumination. At the end of the first day, when Penney and his wife tallied their numbers, they had generated nearly $500 in cash sales, at the time when a pair of Levi's jeans ran about 58 cents a pair, and the most expensive item in the entire store was a men's suit for $9.95. And you can see if we convert that to inflation. I don't know if it's last year's inflation, may have changed since I got that number, but 16,000. By the end of the first year, though, the 26-year-old Penney had turned the entire inventory of that store over 3 times, sold the entire inventory over. And the generated sales for that were approximately $29,000, which adjusted for inflation would be $1 million today. Penney's obvious success in Kemmerer gave Callahan and Johnson the confidence to partner with him on 2 additional Wyoming locations, first in the railroad town of Rock Springs, and second in the mining camp of Cumberland. At 29, Penney was overseeing 3 Golden Rule stores. Furthermore, the partnership with Johnson and Callahan was so successful that out of gratitude to his mentors, Penney and his wife chose to name their second child Johnson Callahan Penney after the business partnership, while calling the boy JC Jr. for short. Unfortunately, in 1907, just 5 years into this successful partnership, Johnson and Callahan had a personal falling out with each other. They kept the reasons behind their conflict a private matter, but both men made it clear to Penney they wanted nothing further to do with each other ever again. Despite their quarrel, Johnson and Callahan remained on very good terms with J.C. Penney and requested that he buy out their respective interest in the 3 stores they had jointly owned. Even though Penney lacked the cash to pay for them outright, his personal integrity was so solid that both men agreed to finance the acquisition on nothing more than his word and a handshake. To expedite paying off his former partners, Penney quickly sold back the Rock Springs location to his cousin, scaling his own chain back to just the 2 Wyoming stores in Kemmerer and Cumberland. However, this move was merely a retrenchment for aggressively expanding his own chain, using his own clerks to create a retail empire based on mutually beneficial partnerships. Penney began aggressively recruiting and hiring promising clerks he could mentor, while simultaneously scouting new locations for the new stores he could jointly open with them as partners. Promising clerks would start out in the Kemmerer store before moving on as store management trainees in nearby Cumberland, and then ultimately their own store. Many of them were young men Penney personally recruited from his hometown of Hamilton, Missouri, including boyhood friends, his baby brother Herbert, and children from his older sister Mittie Whitman. Penney continued to operate his stores under the Golden Rule name, but out of respect for Johnson, Callahan, and other related proprietors under that Golden Rule syndicate, he refused to enter any community where they were already operating. Of course, Penney could only open new stores as fast as he could scout new locations, recruit new associates, and train store clerks to eventually run them as profit-sharing managers. Furthermore, as with Johnson and Callahan, the promising clerks would have to come up with 1/3 of the investment to open the new store in order to become profit-sharing partners. The expansion of Penney's Golden Rule chain was initially rather slow, moving from the 2 Wyoming stores in 1907 to just 6 in 1909. By 1912, however, Penney had opened his 34th location and was well on track to doubling that number within just 2 years. From 1902 to 1909, Penney had used the Kemmerer store as his base of operations. That arrangement was suitable for overseeing a handful of stores, but certainly not a growing retail organization. The initial growth from 2 stores to 6, with 8 more planned just for 1910, led Penney and his partners to establish a central office in downtown Salt Lake City inside the Joseph Kearns building. Penney likewise moved his wife Berta and their 2 sons to a new home in Salt Lake City. Tragically, just as his chain of stores were beginning to take off, his wife Berta contracted pneumonia during a December rainstorm. Penney had been scouting stores in the Pacific Northwest and received a telegram to urgently return to Salt Lake City. He arrived to find his wife bedridden inside their home, and Berta Penney passed away the day after Christmas in 1910. The loss of his wife devastated Penney and in many ways encouraged him to immerse himself even further into the growth of his retail chain. By 1912, Penney had recruited 35 clerks who had become store managing, profit-sharing partners. And like compounding interest, these ambitious partners could team up with Penney to mentor their own store clerks into managers and create future partners for new Golden Rule stores in Penney's chain. In some cases, Penney even partnered with clerks directly, putting up 2/3 of the investment himself to match the 1/3 investment that they provided. The ongoing growth of the chain forced Penney and his store managing partners to incorporate their partnerships into one central entity, initially called the Penney Stores Company in 1911, before moving on to become the J.C. Penney Company in 1913, as we know it ever since. To take better advantage of financial institutions and merchandise suppliers, Penney's base of operations would also have to relocate again, this time from Salt Lake City to New York City, with Penney and his senior partners now serving as corporate executives. And the irony of that move is it was sort of a reverse manifest destiny. You know, this entire operation of Penney's was in the American West, and so it was a little bit cumbersome until those JCPenney stores could make their way back east. Just before the move, however, Penney and his senior partners sat down in a Salt Lake City hotel room and codified their Golden Rule philosophy into a mission statement for the company as it prepared for nationwide growth. This document, known as the Penney Idea, articulated the core Golden Rule values that had defined Penney's chain and codified them to guide it as it continued becoming America's first nationwide department store. In the 4 years after moving to New York City, Penney's 48-store chain of Golden Rule stores had nearly quadrupled to 177. Even more impressive, however, was the $6 million increase in revenue across those stores, rising from $2.6 million to $14.9 million over the same period. And just to interject this, by the early 1920s, those stores were collectively outselling the R.H. Macy Company. As a founder and leader, Penney had been shouldering much of the burden for that growth himself, essentially functioning as a CEO and chairman of the board at the same time. In the aftermath of his wife's death, the workaholic lifestyle had been somewhat therapeutic. However, Penney was not an autocratic leader and willfully allowed partners like Earl Corder Sams, a gifted clerk he had hired in 1907, to help him shape the retail chain as it continued to grow. Penney continued to embrace the Golden Rule name for every one of his stores, but after the chain was formally incorporated, his personal name began to appear beneath it on storefronts and newspaper ads. Senior partners like Earl Sams increasingly believed the Golden Rule nameplate should be completely dropped from all of Penney's stores and superseded by Penney's abbreviated name. Ironically, it was J.C. Penney who strongly disagreed with that idea, and after finally insisting that the matter be put to a formal vote, the only no vote against calling the stores J.C. Penney came from J.C. Penney himself. And as Penney said, the decision was taken to change the name to J.C. Penney Company from Golden Rule Store. Personally, I felt reluctant to make the change because Golden Rule was far more than just a name to me. It had a definite significance in the relation to the operation of the stores. But the judgment of my associates prevailed. Incidentally, it was Mr. Sams's turn to smile because the term was abused in many quarters, or at best passively interpreted, and from the time he had joined me in Kemmerer, he had disbelieved in our using it. Sams was 9 years younger than Penney, but a retail wunderkind who had increasingly earned the trust and respect of Penney and every one of his partners. In 1917, after a doctor demanded that Penney change his lifestyle, he decided it would be in his and the company's best interests to turn over at least the daily CEO activities of his work to a trusted associate. Penney made it clear he was not retiring from his company. He would stay on actively as chairman, maintaining his control and say over major company policies and decisions. But after making the announcement at a company convention, he immediately nominated Earl Corder Sams for the role of CEO, and the vote confirming Mr. Sams was unanimous. Sams would ultimately lead and share, oops, I got a little bit behind on my slides, sorry about that. Sams would ultimately lead and shape Penney's company for the next 3 decades. He drew little attention to himself and was comfortable operating behind the enigma of the more prominent and iconic company founder. However, there is no denying his indelible influence on Penney Stores and Company, not the least of which was calling them J.C. Penney. By 1925, 8 years after he had been elected CEO, Sams had reached the milestone of opening Penney's 500th location in the chain. Deliberately, in Penney's hometown of Hamilton, Missouri, ironically a friendly acquisition of the J.M. Hale store that had first employed J.C. Penney as a teenage stock clerk. Just 3 years later, Sams had again doubled the size of Penney's chain, this time unveiling its 1,000th location in Beloit, Kansas, again the very place where Earl Quarter Sam's had gotten his start as a teenage clerk. Although the JCPenney chain had been built on small rural towns, Sam's would go on to position JCPenney stores in major cities like Seattle, Washington, with Penney himself opening the company's first metropolitan location there on the corner of 2nd and Pike in 1931. And by 1948, positioning the company's first location away from a main street altogether in the suburban shopping center on the western edge of St. Louis. As chairman of the board, Penney remained the ultimate authority over the JCPenney company and the chain of stores he had founded. But from 1917 onward, with Earl Quarter Sam's now leading its day-to-day operations, Penney's time, energy, and attention could be directed towards interests outside of retail. And that takes us very close to home in terms of JCPenney in Florida. Now, James Cash Penney's first trip to Florida was right here in Palm Beach in 1912 when he was still living and working out of Salt Lake City. His chain was just beginning to take off at the time, and to say that he enjoyed life in Palm Beach is probably an understatement. He remained rather a workaholic for the next 5 years, but his trips back to Florida were at least once a year, and they always involved Palm Beach. But at that time, Penney was only a passing tourist. What changed after 1917 is that with Earl Quarter Sam's now running the CEO day-to-day opportunities of the JCPenney company, he could sort of spread his wings and travel a little bit further away from the JCPenney headquarters. Now, he didn't come to Florida right away. What he did instead was moved north of New York City to Westchester County and a farm that he had purchased. What was I saying with this? This was called, this farm that he had created there was called Whitehaven. And John and I were talking about this earlier, the influence of Whitehall probably having on JCPenney's ideas and naming it that. But you'll see that there was another Florida home that Penney had that he also named Whitehaven. But Whitehaven provided a reconnection with agriculture for JCPenney. You saw the bull that he had. He was getting into this idea of breeding better livestock for common farmers across the United States. Now, you had at that time experiment station farms. You had the very beginning of agricultural extension activities. But one of the things Penney said is these are just getting started. And it's true, if you look at the history of some of those, they were very poorly funded, even though they were great publicly funded ideas. They were generally, it was up to the individual states to promote those. And so one of the things Penney said is if not for the man of means to do this, I don't know who possibly could do this. And what had kind of begun shaping his ideas to think that way was romance coming into Penney's life again. And in this case, Mary Kimball was a woman that he had met. She was independently wealthy, but had actually grown up in Utah in the Salt Lake City area. So they already had connections, and romance began to take off with them. Penney's 1919 marriage, to Mary Kimball and the 1920 birth of their infant son, Penney's third child, became their catalyst for relocating to the Sunshine State. After braving a New York's winter with their new baby, Mary had suggested that the three of them could all benefit from a warmer winter home, and Florida was the first place that came to mind. Penney, however, did not come to Palm Beach. Instead, he decided to purchase an opulent Florida estate in the Biscayne Bay on the man-made island of Belle Isle, just off Miami Beach, and coincidentally, within a half a mile of the Flagler Memorial Island. Christened as Whitehaven, the same name he had given to his New York farmstead, Penney's Belle Isle mansion became a pleasant sanctuary for his entire family, which included not only his new wife and infant son, but older son Roswell and J.C. Jr. from his first marriage to Berta Penney. The Florida home brought Penney and his family 2 happy years. However, on Valentine's Day, 1923, Mary Penney began to complain of mild stomach pains. She said it was nothing serious to worry about and retired to bed. Unfortunately, her condition rapidly deteriorated, and she died from internal bleeding inside their home the following day at just 43. Mary Penney's death was a complete blow to James Cash Penney. and the premature loss of yet another loving wife and young mother was very hard for him to take. Their Belle Isle home, where she had died, with Penney crying by her bedside, subsequently became a painful reminder of her ongoing permanent absence. However, Mary Penney's love of both Florida and philanthropic causes became an inspiration for her husband as he processed his grief. And in his words, "Her departure has impressed me with the necessity of living each day as if it were the last," Penney confided to a friend in a handwritten letter. "Besides, it has brought me into closer realization of the power of God. It has also made me feel that I have not rendered the service to my fellow man that I should have, and from now on it shall be my endeavor to put forth a greater effort." In the aftermath of his second wife's death, Penney earnestly began to look for ways he could honor her. During a winter stay at the Belle Isle home, a friend informed him about a failed farming colony in northern Florida. The enormous property south of Jacksonville covered 187 square miles, but had gone into receivership, and Penney drove up from Miami to personally inspect it. He submitted a modest $400,000 bid on the property before returning to New York, not thinking it would be seriously considered. However, as he wrote to his older sister, Mittie, in late 1924, "I made a rather hurried and unexpected trip to Florida. You will open your eyes when I tell you that I am on a deal for 120,000 acres of land down there. Now, you may have the idea I once had about Florida land, that most of it is underwater. True, there is a lot of such land, but this is high, dry, with 10,000 acres cleared, much of the ground cultivated, ready for potato planting, etc. It is a big proposition and would take quite a while to tell you of all it consists. If the deal goes through, though, and I will know in about 30 days, I will send you some literature regarding the tract." Penney had ambitious plans for the Clay County property, not as a money-making investment for himself, but a philanthropic opportunity to make farm ownership in Florida possible for thousands of promising families across the United States who wanted it, provided they met Penney's strict standards encompassing Protestant work ethic and his own moral code. As Penney explained, "The venture harmonized well with my interpretation of the Golden Rule and the obligation I had to the fact that I got my start in the store business through the lift which the original owners of my first store gave me. Penney Farms became, in effect, my expression of the fact that if Mr. Johnson and Mr. Callahan could have faith in me, they had laid it upon me to pass along that faith by reposing faith in other men." Working with managing partner Ralph Gwynn, Penney initially committed over $12 million to the project, generously making infrastructure improvements and modernizations to create agrarian subdivisions throughout the massive Florida tract, with farm sizes ranging from 5 acres to 20 acres. The farmhouses Penney constructed for each farmstead were modern for their time, as were the outbuildings for storing implements and equipment. Families began moving onto Penney Farms in 1925, just 8 months after Penney had bought the property, and steadily continued over the next 3 years. Penney also invested in improvements to what had previously been called Long Branch City, restoring the agrarian town as a trade center and eventually having it renamed Penney Farms in honor of his parents. In addition, Penney and Ralph Gwynn established an agricultural institute at Penney Farms in 1926 to augment and cooperate University of Florida extension efforts as well as Florida Agricultural Experiment Station efforts. The Institute even brought in renowned faculty from around the United States to provide agricultural education to visiting scholars, students, and researchers. As a personal philanthropic project of J.C. Penney, Penney Farms was not officially part of the J.C. Penney Company. Nevertheless, as founder and chairman of the board of that company, Penney utilized J.C. Penney stores and J.C. Penney store managers to recruit prospective families to the farming colony. Applications could be filled out and submitted at any J.C. Penney store. Penney Farms also provided assistance for growing and marketing a variety of crops, from cotton to potatoes and, of course, oranges. In addition to an on-site cannery, one of the greatest successes at Penney Farms was its dairy operation, which Penney would eventually rename Foremost Dairies after his prize Guernsey bull. Above and beyond Penney Farms, though, Penney was inspired one night to embark on an even greater philanthropic project within the same vicinity. An idea came to me during the dark watches of one night, explained Penney, which, if I could translate it into tangible form, might be a bright and shining lodestar throughout the lifetime of Penney Farms. My father had died in 1895 and my mother in 1913. It seemed to me that a chapel surrounded by homes for men and women who had devotedly followed the Christ whom my parents served, pouring out their lives for the holy cause in which my parents lived and died, would be as fitting an expression of my gratitude as any. Penney spared no expense when it came to making this later vision a reality. In what became known as Memorial Home Community, he immediately committed $2 million of his own savings to the project, enlisting prominent architects to design an enclave of buildings using Norman-style features with landscaping engineered by horticultural faculty from Clemson University. Ground was officially broken for the project in the summer of 1926, and Penney took great pride in personally returning and laying the cornerstone for the center of the community, a giant house of worship known as Memorial Church. The attractive Norman-style cottages that sprang up around the church featured such modern amenities as indoor plumbing and electricity. Penney personally covered the rent and utilities for every home, leaving occupants responsible for their own food and clothing, though in extreme cases, Penney was willing to subsidize those expenses as well. The homes themselves were completely furnished, but people were encouraged to provide their own linens as well as dishes. Residents at Memorial Home Community began arriving in the fall of 1926, and Penney again returned for the church's dedication in April 1927, an event attended by several Florida dignitaries, including Governor John Martin. Both Penney Farms and Memorial Home Community concurrently thrived from their inceptions through 1929. That same year, Penney also made headlines in Florida for making his Belle Isle home, Whitehaven, available free of charge to incoming President Herbert Hoover and his wife Lou. 1929 was turning out to be the greatest year of James Cash Penney's life. His company was opening almost 400 new J.C. Penney stores that year, more than one every day, with a forthcoming IPO planned for October. Stay tuned on that. The chain had become so successful that Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward had both approached Penney with attractive merger offers, which he and Earl Corder Sams reviewed and respectfully declined. Now, I want to say something. A lot of people think that all three started out as bricks and mortar chains, but Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward did not get into physical department stores till about 1925. J.C. Penney, on the other hand, did not get into catalog merchandising until 1963. So they were kind of the big three, but they were very different in that regard. Furthermore, a Harper Brothers autobiography about Penney's life and retail empire, titled J.C. Penney and very accurately titled Man with 1,000 Partners, was also about to be published that year. Penney was even more fulfilled in his personal life, having married his third and final wife in 1926. Caroline Alton-Reith was 20 years Penney's junior, but had already given Penney his first daughter, Mary Frances, in 1927, and was pregnant with their second daughter, Carol Marie, Penney's fifth and final child. The happiness from Penney's personal and professional life was only amplified by the satisfaction of his philanthropic activities in Florida. However, while Penney's Memorial Home Community appeared to be a great success, it was completely subsidized by Penney's personal finances and benevolence. By contrast, the agricultural community of Penney Farms was far more dependent on the success of individual farmers, particularly their agricultural production, as well as favorable crop markets and prices for the crops they produced. As farmers struggled to sustain a living off their fields, the adjacent farmsteads Penney had built up and paid for were increasingly being abandoned on Penney Farms. By 1930, Penney had stopped recruiting any additional families to the farming colony, and his agricultural community had visibly become, in the words of one Florida publication, a cooperative blunder. Ironically, the failure of Penney Farms would be the least of James Cash Penney's problems. In his zeal for advancing his philanthropic projects in Florida, Penney had leveraged his entire $40 million fortune, largely held in his J.C. Penney stock shares, as collateral to borrow funds from 5 major banks and, in 1928, acquire controlling interest in City National Bank of Miami. The purpose of the loans were to expedite the completion of both Florida projects, and Penney did not mind paying the accruing interest himself if the loans could accelerate their benefits to the people he wished to serve. In addition, Penney's bank in Miami could facilitate funding smaller personal loans in support of the philanthropic projects. Even with extremely good intentions, such risk was unusual for a man who bore the middle name of Cash and deeply eschewed credit of any kind. But Penney's personal net worth had only gone up since opening his first store in 1902 and appeared to be on the same upward trajectory after he took the entire chain public on October 23, 1929. Of course, just 6 days after the J.C. Penney Company went public, the stock market crashed, and the dominoes of Penney's good fortune began to quickly tumble. If the saying, "no good deed goes unpunished," was true, then James Cash Penney was about to be punished for every good deed he had ever undertaken in Florida. From November 1929 to December 1930, James Cash Penney's $40 million fortune was gradually wiped out. Not only was all of Penney's cash completely depleted, the result of personally guaranteeing depositors in the Miami bank against pre-FDIC runs on the bank, so were nearly all of his J.C. Penney Company stock shares he had put up as collateral, which enveloped his entire equity in the company and his only source of income, since he refused to draw a salary from the company he had funded since 1909. Furthermore, even after the banks commandeered and sold out his stock shares, Penney remained on the hook for $7 million in the remaining debts for Penney Farms and Memorial Home Communities, not to mention a looming $3.5 million lawsuit from the remaining account holders in his failed Miami bank, who had lost every dollar they had deposited. Seeing bankruptcy as morally wrong, Penney frantically began selling off assets in order to pay down the sudden debts and hope to generate cash. The Belle Isle state that had ushered Penney's residency in Florida was the first to go. Penney additionally utilized his son Roswell to help liquidate the assets of Penney Farms, selling off nearly all of the 120,000-acre property until only the 200 acres that held Memorial Home Community remained. Penney kept a brave public face as these private struggles wore on. However, the astounding losses privately began to take their toll throughout 1931, not just financially, but emotionally. On top of suddenly being broke with no sign of recovery, the $3.5 million lawsuit from City National Bank of Miami was leading Penney not only to deep depression, but a complete nervous breakdown. My slide didn't transfer right. It's supposed to have a black background, but you'll appreciate what Mr. Penney has to say if you can't read that. He said, this was years later, he confessed this to his son Roswell. "My bank experience nearly ruined me. No one knows what I went through. I suffered the tortures of the damned, yet I kept on going and held my head up. I have made lots of mistakes, which I hope to not make again." As a distraction from his problems, Penney spent significant time away from his family in New York, his company in New York, and especially his failed endeavors in Florida. He deliberately began lengthy travels on behalf of the company, traveling completely by himself, visiting J.C. Penney stores in nearly every state, frugally dining and sleeping inside the homes of the local J.C. Penney managers he would visit, and speaking directly with company associates and customers on J.C. Penney's sales floors about the problems they collectively faced. However, as 1931 wore on, Penney was convinced more than ever that he would be a dead man by the end of the year. On a visit to a J.C. Penney store in Battle Creek, Michigan, a local physician and boyhood friend who had grown up with Penney in Hamilton, Missouri, was astonished by Penney's deathly appearance, which was only compounded by a bad case of shingles. The doctor forbade Penney to continue his travels any further and immediately admitted him to the nearby Kellogg Sanitarium. At the time, Penney's greatest fear about being admitted to the sanitarium was the fact that he had no cash to pay for any of the medical bills he was about to incur. But while the Kellogg Sanitarium marked rock bottom for his physical and emotional health, the nadir of his own personal Great Depression, it also led him to a supernatural experience inside the sanitarium chapel in the middle of a night that he thought was his last one on earth. Penney had called out to God that night and firmly believed that God had answered, and his rapid recovery immediately after that night in the chapel, physically as well as spiritually, amazed the doctors and nurses who had been treating him, enough so that they released him with a clean bill of health just 6 days later. The recovery eventually extended to Penney's personal finances as well. After longtime senior partners like Earl Corder Sams and other J.C. Penney executives found out what the company founder had gone through, they deliberately bought back many of Penney's liquidated shares, either returning them to him directly at no cost or providing a way for him to buy them back on very generous terms. Sams also insisted, against Penney's wishes, that he begin drawing an actual salary from the company he had founded again. Penney never regained the apogees of his 1929 fortune, but his vitality, unbreakable faith in God, and optimism for the future of the country were restored and galvanized and would remain core strengths for him for the next 40 years of living he still had ahead. Despite the pain and failure that had come from Penney's Florida activities, his foremost dairy initiatives in Green Cove Springs would become an overwhelming success far beyond the boundaries of Penney Farms. The original dairy cooperative had failed along with the farming colony in 1931, but Penney was able to revive it in 1934 and ultimately build up a second highly successful company in his name. In time, Foremost Dairies would dominate Florida, the South, and much of the United States before expanding even internationally and being broken up by antitrust laws. Like Earl Corder Sams, Paul Reinhold had been personally selected by James C. Penney as a trusted partner and CEO to oversee the daily operations of Foremost as it continued to grow. Virtually no traces from Penney Farms survived after the 1930s, but Penney's memorial home community remained alive and intact just as Penney had envisioned and hoped it would. To protect it from mismanagement and closure, he deeded the 200-acre property and all of its buildings to the Christian Herald magazine and its non-denominational clergyman, Daniel Poling, to oversee it. Returning to that Florida property and personally interacting with its residents brought Penney a deep happiness that lasted the rest of his life. Penney's eldest son, Roswell, remained in Florida as well, settling in Daytona Beach after helping his father sell off the assets of Penney Farms and later reviving Foremost Dairies in Green Cove Springs. Of course, Penney also took great delight in returning to Florida for new J.C. Penney stores, such as this one in downtown Jacksonville. The store's reasonable proximity to his son's family and the memorial home community led Penney to preside over the store's grand opening in 1956, where Penney asked associates to respectfully bow their heads as he led an opening prayer, while excited customers along the sidewalk eagerly waited for him to finish and finally unlocked the front doors to personally greet them as they entered inside. As Penney recovered from the Great Depression, agriculture had once again begun to take a prominent place in his life, intersecting and at times even rivaling his better-known work in retail. Penney Farms had certainly been Penney's largest agricultural undertaking, but it was far from being his only agrarian operation. Even after the failure of Penney Farms in 1931, Penney actively operated 14 other farms in 3 different states, including 10 in his native Missouri. With partner Jimmy Dodge, he had already established himself as a formidable breeder of Guernsey dairy cattle throughout the 1920s. The Emmeline farm in upstate New York continued to thrive as well, with outstanding Guernsey cattle and a growing Emmeline dairy operation similar to his Foremost operations down here in Florida. Beginning in the late 1930s, with his personal finances somewhat restored, Penney gradually brought back the Missouri farm he had grown up on, as well as the farmland around where he had been born and raised. Furthermore, he transformed his father's homestead into a modern demonstration farm that bred and sold draft horses, mules, and black Angus cattle. The Angus cattle at Home Place Farms were considered in the top 5 of Angus seed stock around the United States from the 1940s through the 1950s, with names like Dwight Eisenhower, Tennessee Senator Al Gore Sr., and Hollywood actor Fred McMurray among its cattle-buying clientele. In addition to breeding and selling Guernsey and Angus cattle, Penney concurrently began improving Hereford beef cattle, as well as breeding and selling quality horses and jacks, often at a loss, as prime movers for farmers before tractors eventually supplanted them. Often, Penney displayed the trophies and ribbons of his award-winning livestock in J.C. Penney stores throughout the nation. At times, he even brought some of his barnyard animals inside a J.C. Penney store, in this case, a prize jack stud at his hometown location in Hamilton, Missouri. However, Penney was not some rich hobby farmer flaunting his status, wealth, and power around the state where he was born and raised. Rather, his 10 Missouri farms were a post-Penney Farms encore of practicing the golden rule for the common farmer again, on soil he was much more familiar with, and using significantly fewer yet significantly larger farmsteads in the process. Penney visited his 10 Missouri farms at least twice each year, from the late 1930s into the late 1960s. As such, he was never averse to donning work clothes and shoveling manure, and if anyone from New York, including his wife Caroline, complained about the unpleasant barnyard odors, Penney's typical response was, that's just the smell of money. Even in his New York City attire of a 3-piece suit with dress shoes and a hat, Penney had no problem milking a prize cow by hand at livestock shows, or when the opportunity presented itself, showing a young boy how to properly hold a jack colt, or training twin baby calves to drink out of a bucket, a faster and more efficient method than having them suck on nipple pails. Perhaps the most unusual activity in rural Missouri for J.C. Penney was his making surprise personal visits to the humble dwellings of promising young tenant farmers he had vetted, introducing himself as J.C. Penney at the front door before coming inside, revealing that he was about to purchase the farm they were renting, and then revealing to the farmer and his wife that he was giving them an opportunity to personally partner with him as he improved and modernized the entire farm at his expense. In each farming partnership, Penney would provide all of the capital improvements for the farmer who had been living and working there, including construction of a modern farmhouse with full utilities as well as spacious new barns for the livestock. In return, the farmer would provide all of the labor and half of the operating expenses to operate the farm, while the farmer's wife would be trusted to keep meticulous records of all income and expenses. Just as Penney had done with sales clerks and managers in the J.C. Penney Company, profits from these operations would be split between the partners, in this case, the farmer and J.C. Penney. Amazingly, no written contracts or attorneys were involved in these partnerships. However, Penney's ability to provide them was limited by how quickly he could acquire and modernize these big Missouri farms, nearly all of which were in excess of 1,000 acres, which was a very large size at the time he was doing that, ahead of his time. And of course, the biggest limitation was Penney's own selectivity for who could become his farming partners. Again, they had to adhere to his strict moral code. Despite being a household name and the chairman of a national department store chain, Penney would personally visit every Missouri farmer at least twice a year, sleeping in a bedroom inside each farmhouse, typically for 2 to 3 nights at a time, and eating home-cooked meals with the farmer's wife and children before moving on to the next farm or business activities involving new J.C. Penney stores. While Penney still had an office at the J.C. Penney headquarters, he frequently conducted company business in and out of the farms, traveling to grand openings for new stores before coming back to rural Missouri as opposed to New York City. At times, his schedule looked more like a Missouri resident occasionally returning to New York City to, for example, take his wife to the opera or attend functions for the company at the headquarters than a New Yorker visiting his Missouri farms. Even from his office in New York City, Penney and the Missouri farmers frequently corresponded back and forth, with the content of Penney's letters inevitably shifting away from agribusiness to the well-being of their wives and children, which Penney knew by name. In the case of one Missouri partner, a poor tenant farmer named Marshall Meservey, Penney practically became part of their family as a result of the partnership and his many visits back to their farm. In 1940, the partner and his wife were already so grateful for his impact on their lives that they named their second son, James Cash Meservey, in his honor. Furthermore, when Marshall's daughter, Doris, got married in 1962, Penney completely arranged his schedule in New York City so that he could personally attend her wedding ceremony at a country church in rural Missouri. Decades later, as a retired nurse and great-grandmother in the nearby town of Bethany, Doris reflected on the personal impact of the department store icon and how it affected her family. It really wasn't until after Mr. Penney died that we finally began to grasp how the rest of the world saw him, she remarked in 2015. I guess my brothers and I had never stopped to consider that the humble man we all knew on our farm was actually quite famous outside of it. Penney would continue his farming partnerships into the late 1960s, eventually selling the last of the giant farms to Marshall Meservey and his brother Eldon, his two most successful farming partners, while visiting award-winning Guernsey cows he had personally donated and endowed at a dairy research facility he had set up at the University of Missouri in Columbia. At the time of his death in 1971, Penney was still breeding and selling Angus cattle in upstate New York and working to improve the National 4-H Center outside Washington, D.C. And if you've seen that center, it's called J.C. Penney Hall. There's a giant mural that shows his impact on agriculture inside of it. Historian Robert Caro, whose work has examined powerful men in the 20th century of America, has often remarked that power can corrupt or it can cleanse, but it always reveals. As the creator and head of nearly 2,000 department stores bearing his abbreviated name, James Cash Penney had undeniably attained a great deal of power during the early 20th century, the equivalent, at least in scope and status, of contemporary retail icons like Sam Walton and Jeff Bezos. Yet Penney's unusual interactions with rural America and American agriculture through small-town stores, and particularly his benevolent livestock breeding and personal agrarian partnerships, served as an unconventional, if not entirely new, alternative to that typical power narrative. And I just wanted to kind of wrap this up by talking about how this happened afterwards. Penney lived to be 95. He died in February of 1971, and he was very lucid all the way through that time. Up until about 5 years before his death, he was so frugal that he insisted on taking the New York City buses to work at the Avenue of America's J.C. Penney headquarters until he slipped and fell trying to catch a bus that would not stop for J.C. Penney. And so they decided that maybe a personal car would be better at that point, and he relented. But he hoped that he could live that long. He truly hoped that he could live to be 100 years old. Of course, the company that he founded survives today. It's gone through a few rough times. 2020, it went bankrupt, ironically from having too much credit and not enough cash, but it's still in operation today. And I wanted to show you the interesting thing about that legacy is that really for nearly the first 100 years of the J.C. Penney company, every CEO had come up through the company ranks. And the first 5 CEOs that succeeded J.C. Penney, Mr. Penney personally knew them. And so it's kind of an interesting contrast when we look beginning in the year 2000 with Alan Questrom. There have been just as many CEOs of J.C. Penney since that time. And Questrom turned the company around in 2000, and now Mark Rosen hopefully will do that as well in 2024. We didn't talk about architecture, but J.C. Penney had a lot of standardized store models that came across. Anytime you're going to open 1,000 new department stores in the 1920s, you need some sort of standardization. So this was one of their models called the Cortland. and it was a double room prototype, Mr. Penney called this. And if you remember any of these Main Street stores, when you walked in, there typically was a balcony that extended over the rear of the sales floor, and that's what this prototype was. Some of them, they haven't been J.C. Penney stores for ages, but they're now being recognized for their historical values. This one in Glendive, Montana is on the National Register of Historic Places as one of these early J.C. Penney stores in rural America. And we can't deny the influence that J.C. Penney had even on companies like Walmart. Sam Walton on the left and his brother Bud on the right began their retail careers at J.C. Penney as management trainees in the stores in Des Moines, Iowa and Marshalltown. The only thing that took them away from J.C. Penney was World War II, and we know what they did after they got back from World War II. But even if you read Walton's biography, or it's like an autobiography, not long before his death, he reminisces. He called J.C. Penney the Cadillac of the industry. When he graduated from the University of Missouri, that's where he went to work, and not only did he get to work under an outstanding management trainer that he said got him excited about retail, he personally met Mr. Penney during one of his store visits and never forgot that. And then there's other people that'll kind of surprise you. A few years ago when J.C. Penney went bankrupt, Warren Buffett was a guest on one of the shows, and they said, what do you think about J.C. Penney? You know, can they survive? And I'm sure Berkshire Hathaway had divested its stocks long before that. But what Warren Buffett says, if you can't read that in the back, I've got this huge rooting interest for Penney's. I mean, I worked there when I was 16, selling Towncraft shirts at $1.98 and $2.98. I sold men's clothing, I sold children's, and I loved it. I've always loved the company. And beyond the commerce, there is something that seems kind of lovable about the company. Penney's philanthropy still continues. This was an organization that he started in 1932. It didn't end in 1922. They were celebrating their 20th or their 90th anniversary, but this is to take care of employees within the company who had fallen on hard times. And we talked about Memorial Home Community, very much alive and well. The suburbs of Jacksonville are almost nipping at its heels now, but it's still in the same form it was, just as Penney envisioned it. Penney would insist that that church is not after himself, that's after his parents. But there are things that were named after him, probably against his will, in the grave. The highway that went past there was originally the James C. Penney Memorial Boulevard, now J.C. Penney Memorial Scenic Highway. But as I was telling you, another legacy that's much less visible are these farming partnerships that he had. And again, these two brothers that are on these tractors were the partners. They were nothing more than tenant farmers that Mr. Penney generously decided to partner with. And over time, they were so grateful that they named that first son James Cash Meservey. But I think it's telling that in 1966, when James Cash Meservey had his son, he also chose to name him James Cash Meservey after Mr. Penney. And Mr. Penney was very much alive and thrilled that he had done that. And he said especially the name Cash, he was pleased. And they wanted me to show you this picture of how farming has changed. So these are family farms that they own outright that Mr. Penney started. Without Mr. Penney, these farms wouldn't have happened. They've gone down about 5 generations, but you can see the tractors are very much different, even though they're technically made by the same company. And culturally, we just can't get away from J.C. Penney. Even if we watch a movie iconic like Back to the Future, where does that scene take place? In front of a J.C. Penney store. And even when they made this on Broadway 2 years ago, they had to take that iconic scene and the J.C. Penney store that was in the background into account. And my final slide that I wanted to show you is this one. In 1996, my brother was stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, and he came across this unusual storefront 6,000 miles away from Kemmer, Wyoming, on one of his walks along the local Main Street. Sandwiched between, if you can see on the left, Snoopy lingerie and what a Korean student told me in Wyoming, it's a karaoke bar on the right. He curiously went inside to visit with the proprietor. This store, not part of American company, a pleasant Korean man informed my brother in broken English. I borrow name after trip to United States. And why did you do that, my brother inquired. And now I can only speculate how our titan of commerce would feel about somebody appropriating or maybe misappropriating his name on their own storefront. But I think if James Cash Penney were alive, he'd probably be a little touched by what this particular owner had to say. I did it because I always liked going inside those stores, the Korean man replied, and I liked the way J.C. Penney made me feel when I was there. Thank you. Oh, okay. Okay. Questions?
Hi, whatever happened to Whitehaven, his home? Is it still standing?
No.
No.
The 1926 hurricane damage that came through there significantly damaged it. They had improved it primarily, I think it was kind of a publicity stunt to have Hoover stay there for free. And then it really fell into disrepair. I think it was already gone by the early 1950s. There's no trace of it that's left now.
Can you elaborate on the purpose of Memorial Home?
Yes. So the idea of that, we have to go back a little bit to Mr. Penney's father and the denomination that they preached under. That was the Old School Baptists. Sometimes they called those primitive Baptists. And the idea of those congregations was that if you were called to be a preacher, that was your cross to bear, literally, meaning you weren't compensated for that. So there was no income for these people, and that's why Mr. Penney was saying my father was really a clergyman in reality, but he had to find a way to support his ministry. Well, Mr. Penney took that very personally because without that farm, his father would have had no income. And what happens if there's a couple and the husband dies, the widow is destitute. So the purpose of Memorial Home Community was for him to stand in the gap and provide that living, that retirement living for them, since they had already contributed their lives to the ministry and were not compensated for it.
Thank you for that terrific lecture. That was wonderful. And thanks again to our sponsor, Related. Next week's lecture will be by Dr. Nicole Kirk on John Wanamaker. Before you leave today, you might want to stop by the table at the back. We have Penney biographies, and I'm sure that David would be happy to sign those for you. Thank you all for being here. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.